I just want to advise that some scenes and images in this presentation might disturb some viewers, so please feel free to click off at any time if you feel any means disturbed or uncomfortable.
This is not a love song. 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 This is not a love song.
Waltz with Bashir is a 2008 film narrated by a middle-aged Israeli filmmaker and directed by himself, Ari Folman. The film follows this man as he tries to recall his experiences as a soldier during the 1982 Lebanon War, and more specifically, his role during the Sabra and Shatila massacres, where more than 1,700 Palestinians were murdered by the Lebanese Christian Phalangist militia. The attack was carried out over the course of 3 days in revenge for the assassination of Lebanon's newly elected president, Bashir Gemayel, which was blamed on the Palestinians. The Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, provided military cover for the Phalangists and were therefore complicit in the massacre. Waltz with Bashir belongs to a group of Israeli films which all address questions of memory and trauma relating to experiences of Israeli soldiers. These films were all produced within 1 year of one another. So let's look at the director. So Ari Folman was born December 17th, 1962 in Israel. When he was 19, he became a soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces during the 1982 Lebanon War, and this was where he witnessed the aftermath of the massacre at the Sabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 generated levels of discontent among Israelis that were unprecedented, and as a result of which national consensus broke down and a vocal opposition to the conduct of the war emerged. This invasion also led to the long Israeli occupation of the south of Lebanon, which lasted until the year of 2000. Over time, the occupation rekindled the thread of criticism to the enterprise in 1982, and by the late 90s, the Israeli military policy in Lebanon faced significant public opposition, largely due to the steady stream of casualties that resulted from an increasingly effective military resistance movement inside Lebanon. So Folman's work as a writer and a director of TV is extensive, and before making Waltz with Bashir, he had already successfully directed and written a handful of shows, and one of them actually won him the Israeli Academy Award. So let's look at what was happening around the time of the film's production and release. So during the summer of 2006, during this film's production, the Second Lebanon War broke out. It began after Hezbollah captured 2 Israeli soldiers from the Israeli side of the Israel-Lebanon border. This war brought back and reinforced the traditional Israeli narrative that had been questioned after the First Lebanon War. The provocation by Hezbollah was seen by the majority of the Israeli public as further evidence that Israel's Arab neighbors were not interested in peace and that there was nothing Israel could do to avoid ongoing violence, even when they were going back to the internationally recognized borders. The Israeli public discourse was supposedly very critical about the way Israel conducted war. This criticism even led to the resignation of Defense Minister Amir Pertez and the IDF Chief of Staff Dan Hulatz. This base of criticism had to do with the broadening gap between Israel's wish and belief that its army could achieve ambitious goals during the war and the public's decreasing will to pay the price of these wars. So at the time of the film's release, on the 27th of December 2008, Israel launched a massive military offense against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The Strip had been placed under an Israeli-led siege a year earlier, subjecting the enclave to a land, air, and sea blockade. The Israeli Air Force fired across the territory, so this 3-week military offense resulted in almost 1,400 Palestinian deaths and thousands of wounded.
The opening sequence from the beginning of the film to roughly 9 minutes consists of 5 scenes which we will refer to as Boaz's nightmare, the conversation, Boaz's recollection, Foreman's reflection, and the dream of rising from the sea. The opening sequence and these subsequent scenes present to the audiences the key issues or central concerns of the film. And from our own assessment and evaluation, and with consideration to scholars' opinions we found while researching, that there are 4 central concerns in Waltz with Bashir, and they are memory and trauma, war, death and destruction, guilt and innocence, and the real and surreal. In the opening sequence, the first scene is of Boaz's nightmare, where adrenaline-charged hounds thunder through the desolate, rain-slicked streets of Beirut in a highly stylized animated illustration, where Foreman leverages the power of color. The sky is imbued with bright yellow, and the shadows of the streets are painted with crushed blues, which evokes a thriller-esque aesthetic which has become mainstream in action and thriller films. Zion Alamegir writes that color is one of the simplest ways through which we can get large amounts of symbolism through to an audience by only visual means. And in Waltz with Bashir, during scenes of high tension and brutal conflict, differing shades of red, yellow, orange, as well as black are omnipresent. These colors are employed to symbolize the surreal, the dreamscape, the hallucinations, the recollections, the nightmares, as we will soon see in Foreman's dream rising from the sea. Villejuin describes the surreal as inexact, splintered, uncertain, incongruent, and surprising, which reflects the audience's experiences in viewing the first scene. This is only reinforced through non-diegetic audio of Max Richter's score and subsequent cue, Boaz and the Dogs, which begins with a foreboding, somber, and dissonant tone that strikingly transforms into a radical pounding synthesizer and driving percussive event that punctuates the pro-filmic events on screen. And so from the very first moment audiences experience Waltz with Bashir, it is clear that the film is going to subvert and challenge our expectations, that our assumptions and established beliefs of film and genre conventions are not going to support easy comprehension and consumption of Waltz with Bashir in our search for meaning. The rabid dogs come to a halt outside a building incessantly barking and grunting, where a man, Boaz, emerges in a window high above. The nightmare ends and cuts to Foreman and Boaz in a conversation in a tavern. The illustration is bleak color-wise with dirty browns, greys, and blacks at the forefront, and so Foreman uses differing color palettes to distinguish between reality or the real in Waltz with Bashir and the bright, striking hot color palette of the surreal. Audiences also get our first indication that the film could possibly be considered and classified a documentary, as indicated by the superimposition of text-based graphics, which reads in the top left placement, Boaz Rain Busquila, and so it begins to feel like a documentary, as is a convention in documentary practice, that when a talking head or participant subject is introduced, a name graphic accompanies the footage. Also, the camera, which as Kramer attests, is a construction of the animation created through manipulation of the image frame by frame, not a physically present camera interacting in the three-dimensional space of the world, follows documentary conventions of a subject center-aligned speaking to an interviewer off-camera. It comes as an immediate surprise then that the next shot or frame shows the interviewer speaking to Boaz. And so we get this kind of feeling that perhaps this documentary is employing the tactics and methodology of the participatory approach or the participatory mode. Because the interviewer is here, and it's actually the director Ari Foreman, who is the main subject in the documentary. Or perhaps in using story-based terms, the main protagonist of the film. So perhaps the film is a documentary, and the filmmaker is in direct contact with the subject in the efforts to create a documentary. Yet the shortcuts between frame or camera angles made in editing the film jumps between over the shoulder and a mid-shot of the two conversing, that of which is atypical and undermines the genre conventions of documentary. Rather, longer takes would be selected and arranged during post-production in the editing room to adhere to established documentary conventions. Instead, Fullman does something new. It feels like a documentary, yet it is presented as a story, and we will discuss this in the documentary modes and genre classification later. As the original poster outlined, the film is based on a true story, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a first-hand depiction of reality. Audiences are then taken into Boas's recollection of the events that took place, in that he was bullied by his squad to kill 26 dogs, as so to neutralize any threat of them barking and alerting nearby enemy hostiles. Here, the central concerns of the film coalesce, providing a commentary on memory and trauma, death, destruction, as well as guilt and innocence. Boas's recollection from his memory reveals to the audience that the previous scene was in fact a nightmare, and that this nightmare is spurred on by feelings of guilt in his complicity in destructive efforts in the war. Suzapak deems that the trauma of the war is visually reenacted in the nightmare of the dogs, where only now in a delayed response it takes on legible meaning. By employing dialogue presented as diegetic audio, yet recorded and constructed in post-production, Boas asks Fullman whether he can remember Lebanon and the war, and whether or not Fullman has any recollection of the Shabbatilla and Shatila massacre, because as Boas notes, he was only 100 feet away. Fullman responds it's not stored in his system, and repeatedly contests that he can't remember anything, which, as Suzapak finds, his repeated denial in recalling his war experiences is a manifestation of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and it signifies the presence of a psychological defense mechanism. The two part ways outside in the rain, and Fullman, while driving his car, is shown in deep contemplation as Boas's dream has functioned as a trigger, and certainly as the film's catalyst of Fullman's recovery from mental repression. That is, to uncover his horrific involvement in the First Lebanese War and the ensuing Sabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps massacre. The first discovery in the corner of Fullman's consciousness is of a surreal dream of him and two others rising from the Mediterranean Sea and in the war-torn city confronting chaos of screaming, horrified young and old women. Fullman transitions from the real to surreal by increasing the saturation and hue of the image, adhering to the established color symbolism. Yet before the dream, the car acts as a prelude, and audiences are spoken to through Fullman's non-diegetic voiceover. The meeting with Boas took place in the winter 2006, Fullman says, which gives the events temporal context in a narrative thus far presented in a non-linear manner. Jones notes that the drive from this meeting mirrors the gradual delving into Fullman's mind. Not only do the flashing colours indicate distance travelled and lend an otherworldly down the rabbit hole aspect, but they also show a movement through time. The continuity of direction towards the right, sustained until Fullman reaches the beach, depicts the arrival at a mental destination, the recesses of Fullman's consciousness. Fullman's hallucination or dream of the rise from the sea is surreal in nature, achieved by the sparkles in the water and the omnipresent camera perspective which moves from a point-of-view shot to a wide-angle shot, and the freedom of the camera too adds to this surreal aspect of the scene. Ultimately, the opening scene is crucial to establish and develop the central concerns of guilt, war, memory, and trauma, developed through the filmic techniques of camera, color, editing, graphics, narrative, and audio, both diegetic and non-diegetic.
While in some ways, Waltz with Bashir challenged conventional documentary modes, especially showing realism through the use of animation, but in many other ways, the film is structured in a deeply self-legitimating manner, one that tells more than it shows. The film's use of animation allows for a seamless change between the documentary's interviews and the imaginative sequences, whether that be the flashbacks or the dreams and memories, and this semiotically transforms the spectator's experiences from that of the passive observer of the action to one of being more actively sutured into the film. While removing the heavy authorial hand of a conventional documentary, the result is one where an audience member experiences a similar degree of identification with the character, and in particular with Fullman himself. This identification places the audience member within the action in a way that is much more powerful than conventional documentaries allow, all while at the same time adding this element of authentic testimonial, which provides a further layer of self-legitimation to the film experience. But to maintain a film's status as a documentary and to accurately portray the film of the conflict of war, Folman's use of animation doesn't actually maintain realism. So while the use of animation does play many great roles in this film, animation makes it extremely easy for real image to be distorted and changed to how Folman wants it to be portrayed. However, the film does focus more on the personal and subjective experiences of the soldiers rather than the conflict scenes, which would ethically require true depictions. So therefore, the creative choices made don't ethically cross any boundaries, as they don't necessarily depict real events. The narrative of the film is deeply predicted upon a search for resolution that releases the characters from the ethical burden of memory, without directing the investigation into difficult questions of the broader responsibility of Israel in the war. Folman quite poetically reflects the fragility of individual memory and the threat of destruction, while also teasing the consequences that repression of memory may bring. However, the film itself both constitutes and regulates social memory about the war, and in doing so, it participates in a broader tendency in Israeli public discourse to absent any questions of ideology or historical relationships in setting out an understanding of the prosecution of the war. So by emphasizing a memory and trauma-based framing of the war, Waltz with Bashir promotes the ascendant view that Israeli soldiers and indirectly Israeli society were in some fundamental sense victims of the war themselves, not willful participants whose ideological and political interests were often served by the invasion. So by avoiding an ethical and political consideration of the war's crimes, the film is able to portray the Sabra and Shatila massacre as an event that left Israeli soldiers as the sole comprehensible victims in its wake, the only victims with which the audacity may identify with. So the final sequence of the film, which comprises of the raw footage from the 1982 of a mourning Palestinian woman returning to the camps who's crying out while surrounded by the bodies of those killed, did raise a number of ethical questions. At one level, this ending challenged and even to some extent undermined the suturing effect of the film, deeply upsetting the link between the film and the audience. While this footage is also undeniably very disturbing, the very shocking effect of the change in film language may be seen as also an autocritical move, designed at least to kind of compel the audience to reflect on the process of identification and that characterizes of the film experiences up to that point. I think another important aspect of this final scene also negates the threat of investigation that may have led to an exploration of the question of responsibility, and also in a way specularizes the crime of the massacre along with the suffering of the survivors. And lastly, we also need to look at the ethical reasoning behind Folman's use of this clip. So filmmaker Louis Massar stated, "To use archival footage inaccurately for mood or tone, not looking at archival footage as a document of a particular time and place becomes problematic." It can definitely be seen that this use of the clip was not necessarily wrong in showing a particular time of an event, as it showed the aftermath of the war, but also there is this great sense of this clip also just mainly serving as a piece to set the tone, to kind of lead the audience on this level of thought. Ethically speaking, it's not wrong of Folman to have used this archival footage, since we don't know precisely what his intentions were with it.
Waltz with Bashir is a difficult film to categorize, and there's much scholarly debate around the film's genre categorization, and whether it can even be considered a documentary at all, or whether it is a work of fiction. So can Waltz with Bashir be categorized as a documentary? Those that say no, such as Miller, argue that Waltz with Bashir was not initially marketed as a documentary, and the original Israeli poster contained the subheading "Based on a True Story," which Miller argues sends a clear message that the film is a fiction inspired by real-life events, and this is obviously not the same as documentary. Miller argues that the film has elements akin to documentary, but that it is more of a work of fiction, whereas others have attempted to categorize it into documentary modes delineated by Nichols, as we will see later. Those that say yes, the film is constructed around 10 interview scenes, which leads to the assumption that the film is a documentary. And Miller says the only signpost that Waltz with Bashir is a documentary is its use of interviews. And under Nichols' framework, an interactive documentary is where there's a clear encounter between the filmmaker and the film's participants. And in all instances, with the two exceptions of Boaz and Kami, who refused to have their faces exposed in the film and were both acted and dubbed by professional actors, other than them, the interviewers are not actors, but real people, animated of course, who were involved in some way in the Lebanon War and are speaking out of experience. On the other hand, Miller says, again, no, this cannot be considered a documentary because the on-the-spot quality of the interactive mode, as described by Nichols, in that speech need no longer be reserved for post-production in a studio due to the availability of very portable synchronous sound recording equipment where he or she might fully approximate the human sensorium, looking, listening, and speaking as it perceives events, is simply not followed in Waltz with Bashir. And this is even reflected in the film's production notes, which openly admits that the interviews are not filmed but are recorded in a sound studio. Indeed, the entire film was based on a screenplay written by Foreman after extensive research, and so this highly contrived quality undermines the on-the-spot physical encounter between the filmmaker and their subject, which Nichols finds is a key feature of the interactive documentary. Despite this, the film is perceived as a well-meaning quest for truth in documentary form, where there is an underlying sense that there is an explicit contract between filmmaker and viewer, and that the documentary will give an honest representation of somebody's experience of reality. As Foreman has said in interviews, he wanted to make an animated film based on his experience. Nurit Gertz and Yael Monk further explain this when they say that Waltz with Bashir depicts the Lebanon War as it was experienced by the director. In 2008, Waltz with Bashir was awarded Best Feature-Length Film by the International Documentary Association, and in 2009 it was awarded Best Documentary by the Writers Guild of America. On top of this, Ali Jafar says, Waltz with Bashir is an excoriating autobiographical account of Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. And Garrett Stewart says, Waltz with Bashir creates a document of disavowal, where the word document is crucial as it suggests that the film could be used as historical evidence. And then another argument arises, why categorize the film at all? Well, Time Out critic David Jenkins said Foreman showed a lack of interest in how the film was categorized, although he does see it as an anti-war film. I did my thing and that's it, he says. It's an anti-war film. At least I hope it is. Critics, audiences, schools, they can say whatever the hell they like. It's documentary, it's drama, it's bullshit. That's fine. To make the film and then try to categorize it, I don't have to. Yet many scholars have made efforts to categorize the film, particularly in adhering to Nichols' documentary modes classification. Ward suggests animated documentaries that include voiceovers and involve interviews with participants should be typified under the interactive mode. In Waltz with Bashir, there are many interviews and voiceovers. And so Ward would argue that Waltz with Bashir is indeed classified as an interactive documentary. Del Gaudio understands animated documentaries to be akin to the reflexive mode because animation itself acts as a form of meta-commentary within a documentary. To suggest that by adopting animation as a medium or form of representation, animated documentaries are passing comment on live action's ability or inability to represent reality. On the other hand, Strom and Patrick argue for a performative classification. According to Nichols, the performative documentary underscores the complexity of our knowledge of the world by emphasizing its subjective and affective dimensions. And Patrick identifies this appeal with his claim that the very nature of animation is to foreground its process and artifice.
Waltz with Bashir can be viewed as the ideal art film, for it combines dreams and hallucinations with the fashions of politics, all while 80s electro-pop music is played in the background. The animation sequences move from realistic to those that then resemble an acid trip, whilst the live footage shown at the end of the film creates an opportunity for the viewer to reflect on the nuances of denial and thought, as well as what roles the media has played throughout the film. So it may not come as a surprise when I say that this film was not received well by international critics. Its concerns are too general to appeal to the larger audience, as well as being too vague to be loved universally. So the film's media reception can be categorized into 4 groups. These are accusations of hypocrisy, accusations of negative misrepresentation, and praise for the film's representation of war and trauma. And I will now explore these. So Waltz with Bashir was received well in Israel, where the film actually went on to receive 6 Academy Awards in the country and other nominations, as you can see on this slide. So it can be seen as a bit surprising for the film to have done so well in Israel, considering the country's part in the Sabra and Shatila massacres as a source of conflicting emotions. In fact, Folman even went on to complain that the film was actually too well received in the country, saying, "I was expecting at least a kind of debate, at least a controversy, something. And then I was hugged dearly by all of the political spectrum. The government took it as a project and they kept sending the film all around the world at their expense. I consider myself this really cool rebel and now I'm the government's darling. So it's kind of problematic for me." Folman then further went on to acknowledge that the film's support by the government was all in their favour of just showcasing the country to be of this tolerant nature. So David Sangria, who is the Israeli Council for Media and Public Affairs, had something to say on this. He said, "One of the challenges is that people in the world see Israel as responsible for what happened in the Sabra and Shatila, and this movie shows it was the Lebanese who killed the Palestinians. Second, the fact that the person who is asking the tough questions is Israeli just shows the morality of the Israeli society and the Israeli soldiers. So I don't find it as something that can hurt our public relations." So it's not a huge shock that multiple critics suggested that the film's success in Israel was only because it did shine this very positive light on the country. It made Israel out to be of this courageous and caring nature. So the response from international critics was pretty mixed, but it was mainly positive, as you can kind of see on this slide. One of the most enthusiastic reviews was probably one of the most unexpected, as it came from this online publication called the Palestine Chronicle, which prides itself on promoting no political agenda. So Gilad Atzmon wrote, "To a certain extent, it is a very brave individual attempt to deal with the devastating collective Israeli past. This may explain why the Israelis are so enthusiastic about the film. On one hand, it wasn't them who made the actual kill. On the other hand, loving the film portrays them as first-rate humanitarians." So to summarize, the film criticizes Israel, but it never blames it for the massacre. It's just enough criticism to suggest self-reflection, but not enough to accuse Israel of facilitating genocide. So in Lebanon, where Waltz with Bashir was banned because of this nationwide prohibit on Israeli products, the film was very still much sought for. So it was screened illegally in Beirut in 2009, and this screening attracted mass international media attention. But luckily, most of it was pretty positive. Most of those articles expressed this positive reaction from those attending the viewing, further saying that they praised the film in terms of its courage. Furthermore, an American academic commentator who is in support of how Israel is dealing with the subject wrote that, without comparable productions from Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestine terrorized themselves, and Waltz with Bashir resembles nothing so much as clapping with one hand. So in this sense, we can kind of get this idea that there is a love for the film, because it's dealing with these subjects that the other parties, such as the Lebanese, Christians, and Muslims, fear to broach. So moving on to accusations of hypocrisy. Most of the negative criticism of Waltz with Bashir focused a lot on the bad faith and the unknowingness. Samir Schneiser from the Israeli Daily wrote that it was a progressive movie in the way that it was presented with the animation, but in its conclusions, social and political, it was more mainstream. More so, the head of screenwriting studies at Tel Aviv University accused the film of allowing Israel to detail and focus too much on the phalangists. But on the other hand, while the film was receiving mostly negative reviews from the Arab press, there were still journalists and critics who did defend Folman's film. One was an Egyptian journalist by the name of Joseph Farm, who stated, "I honestly believe it's naive of Arab critics to render the film an Israeli effort, to wash the country's hands of the blood of the Palestinians. The direct involvement of the Israeli soldiers," Arab's critic referred to, is highly questionable, and there is no tangible means of proving it because hardly any footage of the massacre actually exists. Gideon Levy, who is an Israeli journalist, harshly criticised Folman's delayed investigation into this event, which had taken place nearly 20 years before the movie was actually made. He described it as a case of "we shot and we cried." Levy believed that the live footage at the end of the film was the first and last moment of truth and pain in Waltz with Bashir. So in reference to this actual Waltz scene, critic Helen Halkin wrote, "What terrible things Israel has done, and how wonderful it is to have souls sensitive enough to admit it. A country that knows it's choppin' can't be all bad." Halkin's critique can be seen to allude to this strange juxtaposition of the much lauded soundtrack, which does play through many of the violent scenes in the film. And this kind of feeds into this discussion earlier around whether the film actually is the definition of a documentary. So Twitch Films, which is a critique website, did just this. They focused on the definition, and they said that Waltz with Bashir was just anything but that. They were so harsh in their accusations of propaganda, stating that while Waltz with Bashir occupies the upper end of the scale in terms of quality filmmaking, it incredibly dominates the lower end of the political propaganda spectrum with its insidiousness. On the other hand, Yuri Klein, who writes for The Hearts, offered a more calm and collective review. He acknowledged that it was more of a shooting and crying type of a film that expressed an off-putting degree of coyness, guilt, and self-pity. He also concluded that by using animation, it helped to keep this kind of distance between the events depicted and the audience members, making that coyness, guilt, and self-pity from kind of being this embarrassment. Klein doesn't further elaborate on this idea of animation creating this sense, but perhaps what he's trying to say is that the animation distracts the viewer from the film's kind of self-serving message, if you will, and allows the audience to ponder on other universal questions such as trauma or memory. When the film was released in 2008, Israel was, as we know, engaged in the Gaza war. When Folman won a Golden Globe in January 2009, he failed to mention the Gaza war during his speech, and because of this, he was absolutely slammed by critics. In the midst of all of this negative press, many Israelis felt that the film placed the country and the IDF in an overly negative light. It was blurring what life was really like for those Israeli soldiers involved. Soham Nicolette, who is the executive director of the US-based Israeli Leadership Council, said, "The concern of it is the timing. Following the Second Lebanon War and the operation in Gaza, the movie might strengthen a false image of Israel as an aggressive country, victimizing its enemies. Unfortunately, some of the ideas and vocabulary used in the movie can be taken out of context and might reinforce the misleading anti-Israel propaganda." So 2 Israeli soldiers in an interview with Vanity Fair also agreed that the film projected this one-sided representation of Israel. In the interview, they went on to say that they hated the way the soldiers were portrayed in the film, that they were way too over-exaggerated for this artistic effect. They also were offended by the multiple references to the Shoah, going on to say that they felt Folman didn't need to make a connection to the Nazis, as the Holocaust was a final solution and the issue in the film was a local issue and it was wrong to condemn it. So, of course, critics were also concerned about the indulgence of portraying the Israeli soldiers and ignoring the Palestinians. And this is a fair criticism, as the Palestinians in the film are barely seen. And when we do see them, they are either dead or, in this case of the live footage, screaming in Arabic without subtitles to take them from that kind of place just of being an other. So Naira Antun agrees that the representation of the Palestinians in the film is just so dehumanizing that their only function in the film is to show their effect on the Israelis. I think another important thing to note is that the massacre at Sabra and Shatila was perpetrated against the Palestinians, and yet their absence throughout the entirety of the film is shocking. Folman did comment on this, saying he felt very inappropriate telling the Palestinian story for them, hence why he deliberately focused just on the Israelis, because that's what he felt comfortable telling. So ethically speaking, that is fair, but the lack of subtitles during the live footage still should be questioned. Folman never did explain why the Arab woman was never translated, so we simply do not know what his reasoning was behind this. So moving on to praise for representation of war and war trauma, I want to start it off with this quote. In a way, each country reacted to the film like the history of that country. In France, it was all about guilt, mainly because of their past. In Algeria, in Germany, it was all about me doing the comparison of the Holocaust and the massacre. So that was a quote from Folman stressing the film's anti-war message. And I think that's an important one to start off this topic. So Folman stated in an interview with The Guardian that he wanted the film to just show how stupid war is. He didn't want the film to have any glory or glamour, no bravery or any brotherhood of men. In an article by the San Francisco Chronicle, they wrote the universal archetypes in this film. So these were the teenage nerd and the idolized leader, and that in spite of the historical context, the film was telling a bigger story, that war carries a toll on everyone involved, even those who, decades later, might have a superficial idea of a successful life. The Sydney Morning Herald wrote, "It's intended as a war film that will make no one want to join up. It takes away all the conventional excitement that makes young men think going to war might be fun." I think that one of the key universal messages that was relayed in this film was the effect of trauma being both this devastating yet so ever powerful thing. This was also seen as praised by multiple critics. Newsweek said that the film is all just about how memory can distort and shield us from the truth. Besides this praise for the representation of trauma was also the admiration for the use of animation to convey it and what effect in doing this it had on memory. So the art magazine Soma commented on how Waltz with Bashir used 3 different types of animation styles and colour palettes to represent the vagaries of memory, specifically memory that has been affected by a traumatic event. Artist Kim Nicolini wrote, "As Folman gets closer to the truth, the colour begins to dissipate from his vision. The film's palette begins to fade from highly stylized colour-infused animation to grey realism bordering on documentary photography." So to finish this off, the view of the film's praise for its representation of war and war trauma isn't that surprising. I think what's most shocking is how powerful the impact the film had on Israeli war veterans who felt they were forced to relive their traumatic experiences in Lebanon. Folman made a comment saying that ever since the film's release, he's had strangers coming up to him and wanting to talk about their memories of Lebanon,